All right, so chapter 12, last week we covered the last 8 verses of chapter 12. And I named it. You know, I didn't used to name sermons. I just gave you the text where we're preaching from. But when Jason started putting the sermons on YouTube, he wanted titles. So for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been titling sermons. And that can be fun in itself, trying to figure out what do I call this sermon. I come up with an odd name for last week's sermon. Paul's abbreviated Sermon on the Mount. Now, Paul is not preaching Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is Matthew 5, 6, and 7. But what he says in the last part of chapter 12 has that feel to it. It's a much shorter area, 8 verses compared to 3 chapters. But these 8 verses, and I'll even do some quoting from the Sermon on the Mount in there, they have the same feel as the Sermon on the Mount had. So, but it's much shorter, so I entitled it Paul's Abbreviated Sermon on the Mount. Verse 14 said, "Bless those who persecute you." Remember, this is Romans 12, verse 14. "Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse." Now, part of the Sermon on the Mount there, Matthew 5, verses 43 to 45, this is a direct quote from the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talking. "You have heard that it has been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." Notice Paul said, bless those who persecute you. He's telling us, bless them that curse you, and then gets the word persecute in there, Jesus did in the Sermon on the Mount. Has the same feel to it. Verse 45 of that Sermon on the Mount, pray, or rather, the reason I'm supposed to love my enemies, bless them that curse me, do good to them that hate me, and pray for them who misuse me and persecute me, the reason I'm supposed to do that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends his rain on the just and the unjust. So he's saying, if you want to be like God, here's a way to be like God from the mouth of Jesus. Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, so forth. From the writings of Paul, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. So you can see it has the same feel. Now we go back to Paul's writings in verse 15. "Rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn." Now remember, the Sermon on the Mount has, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. So Paul's going into that idea of mourning as well. So rejoice with those, what's that mean? Be happy with those that are happy, and mourn with those that mourn, but of course your mourning will never be the same as theirs, but enter into their mourning, comfort them there in their mourning. Verse 16 in the easy to read version, "Live together in peace with each other." Now this is Paul again. "Don't be proud, but be willing to be friends with people who are not important to others. Don't think of yourselves as smarter than everyone else." My son never thinks he's smarter than everyone else. He knows it. Yeah. But we're not to think of ourselves as being smarter than everyone else. And he said, be willing to be friends with people who aren't important to others. There are those who seek important friends who can help them in their business and whatever it might be. But Paul said, you need to be able to be friends with all of God's people, whether they're, quote, important or not. So, verse 17, "Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Do things in such a way that everyone can see that you're honorable." How that compare to the Sermon on the Mount? Verses 39 to 41 of Matthew 5, Jesus talking again. "But I say unto you that you resist not evil. But whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also." That's what Jesus said. Paul said, never pay back evil for evil. "If any man will," verse 40 of the Sermon on the Mount there, "if any man will sue thee at the law and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also." Would that drive a judge crazy? You just lost a lawsuit, and you got to pay this guy $100,000, so you throw in an extra 25. You say that makes no sense. It doesn't make any sense in the natural, that's for sure. But those were the words of Jesus. If a man should sue thee at the law and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And in verse 41, whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain or two. The idea was there, sometimes when the Roman soldiers were there, if they were doing something and they said, you, come here, you did whatever you were told. Those guys had swords. And so Jesus said, they tell you to do that and more. I try to think of all the Americans fighting for their rights, and we need to fight for our rights because we're about to lose some of them. But fight for them in a certain way. But Jesus said, I'm more interested in you representing me than you winning all of your arguments. I want you to represent me well. So Jesus turned the other cheek, didn't he? All right, so verse 18 down below that sermon, that part of the Sermon on the Mount, back to Romans 12. Do your part to live in peace with everyone as much as is possible. Verse 19, do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it's mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. So again, this has the feel of the Sermon on the Mount. Again, he's saying, don't get even. Don't take revenge. And what's he say about not taking revenge? He quotes from the Old Testament where it said, leave room for God's wrath, for God, it is written. In other words, this is what God said about it. It is mine to avenge, I will repay. So, here's what we could get from that on the surface. If you do me wrong, I shouldn't get even, I should turn you over to God. Sick them God. Because God said, I will repay. Sounds great. I don't have to get even. God will do it. Except for, let me give you a couple examples. Luke 23, leaving room for God's wrath. Luke 23, Jesus on the cross, dying. Verse 34. Then said Jesus, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they parted his raiment and cast lots. Jesus said, Father, forgive them. You know, he's praying for me that day. My sins that put him there. And instead of getting even and returning evil for evil, he said, Dad, forgive Dave. He doesn't have a clue what he's doing. Boy, is that true or what? I spend a lot of my life not having a clue. But anyway, that's another story. Yeah. Acts 7, verse 60, a story about the first recorded, and not necessarily the first Christian martyr, but the first one mentioned in the Bible, Stephen. He is being stoned to death. Acts 7, verse 60. As he's dying, it said, and he knelt down and cried with a loud voice, Lord, lay not this sin to their charge. And when he had said this, he fell asleep. So, tells me not to repay evil, for God will avenge. But then we see in the examples of the New Testament, what God really wants us to do is free him not to have to avenge. Forgive people of their wrongs to us, so it frees God not to get even for us. Now, why is that important? We'll close out with that in a moment. I have a dear preacher friend. He was in a church, and it was a church, different government set up. Every 4 years they voted on the pastor, every 4 years. If you just got there 6 months ago, I mean, this 4 years was nationwide in that denomination. So if you just got voted in 6 months ago, you're going to be voted on again in 6 months because of that 4 year period. And he had been there quite a while, and the guy with the money wasn't real fond of him and voted no. Now, Rick won the vote. He got plenty of votes to stay there. But the state headquarters called him up and said, well, without that guy's support, we'll have trouble keeping that church open, so we're going to place you in another church. So they're going to let this rich guy have his way. And so my buddy Rick got shafted. They put him in a town and had him start a church from scratch. But having said that, the rich man had a child die. And another family that was against him, I think the husband and wife split up. And I remember him telling me one time, see, God avenged for me. God got even for me. And he might have. But it's not what God wanted. God wanted Rick to pray with Jesus, Father, forgive them. Wanted Rick to pray with Stephen, Lord, lay not this sin to their charge. I shouldn't delight when God punishes people who do me wrong. I should be freeing God to do something else that we're about to enter into that might have far better eternal conclusions. Look at the next couple verses, verses 20 and 21. On the contrary, told us not to get even. Now, Paul said, here's what you ought to do instead. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Verse 21, don't let evil get the best of you, but conquer evil by doing good. Conquer evil. Don't enter into evil and become evil yourself. Defeat evil. How do you do that? When somebody is your enemy, be good to them. As much as lies with you, live at peace with all people. You can't control your enemy, but you can do your best to be at peace. And so what's it saying? When you do this, they're hungry, feed them. I always tell people, you got an enemy, bake them a pie and take it over to them. No, don't put anything bad in it. And take them over the pie. Make sure, if you can't bake or if you're tempted to put something bad in it, buy them a pie and take it over to them. And just thinking about you wanted you to have this. It drive them crazy. It'll drive them stinking crazy. And you know the good news? So you're getting a little satisfaction from that. But the good news is, it allows God to heap coals of fire on their head. What's that mean? He can convict them for how they treated you. If you give an evil for evil, they're never going to feel bad about what they did. But if God can convict them because you turned around and did good for evil, returned good for evil, the eternal consequences could be enormous. They could give their heart to the Lord Jesus Christ and go to heaven. So that's how we've ended last week. Now let's go on to this week. Romans 13. We should obey the laws our governments give us. Romans 13, verses 1 to 5. Everyone, verse 1, everyone must submit to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. So what's it telling me? Well, before I get into that, first I just want to note that God has placed governments in place. We need to obey the laws of the government that we are under. Verse 2, consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. Now, he's not talking about judgment from God, although you'd be disobedient to God. He's talking about judgment from the police, whoever, the authorities of the government. So, we are disobeying God when we disobey the laws the government has passed. Now, what can we expect when we disobey the law? We can face the judgment of that government. That judgment might be a ticket, a fine, or jail. Who knows? So, we're being told to obey the laws of the land. Now, verse 3. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. In a perfect world, now the police are like every other workforce in the country. Most of the people are good, and there's a rare exception where somebody's bad. And when there's a bad cop, you got trouble. But in most cases, this is absolutely true. If I obey the law, I got nothing to fear from any officer. Nothing at all. So, rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. Now, I put down under the question, there is an exception to every rule. There's the rule and then there's the exception. But what is the rule of thumb, and we'll get into the exception here soon, but what is the rule of thumb concerning government? If you're a law-abiding citizen, you will live free from fear of that government. If you break its laws, you will live in fear of being caught. All right, now flip her over. Talking about police now, when you put this framework into the government of the USA, for he, or the cop, is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword. Our cops aren't running around with swords. They're running around, I don't even know what kind of guns they have. But let me just say, if they shoot you, it won't be nice. So their sword nowadays is a gun at the hip and a rifle in the car. So they got them some guns. So he does not bear the sword for nothing. So he's saying, if you do wrong, that cop wants to go home too. Just like you want to go home. You do the wrong thing and he thinks he's in danger, guess what he's going to do? If he has to choose between you going home for supper and him going home for supper, guess who he's going to choose? Him. When you're in confrontation with a cop, how many ever been mouthy with a cop? Unfortunately, I have. They pulled me over because I crossed a solid white line because I was in the wrong way and I had to go toward the Kmart when I wanted to go toward downtown. So I crossed it, and they had a trap there that day. They had a cop back here in the parking lot watching, and then calling the cop, radioing over to the cop in junior high school over there. And so he was motioning people in there. And I said, he said, you crossed that solid white line back there, you can't do that. And I looked at him and said, really, you officers have nothing better to do than to pull people over for crossing a white line? Fortunately, he was in a good mood. Could have been Jeff Kuba. He said, you want to go to jail? That's the way he responded. But the truth is, they said if you knew all the accidents in that intersection, well, we used to live about a few blocks in that intersection, never saw any, but that's just us. But nonetheless, cops can frustrate you. When they set these areas that they're policing, it can be frustrating. But they're just doing what they're told. Those cops didn't go there, say, on a whim, say, let's go there. The guy in charge said, you go there and write tickets. We want to teach people to stay in those white lines. So I got a ticket, and fortunately, the first 2 tickets my son ever got, he mouthed off to a cop, and guess what? The cop gave a second one both times.
That was very nice.
He doesn't remember mouthing off. He talked, and he got an extra ticket. Enough said. But anyway, what do you do when an officer pulls you over? Yes, sir. Unless it's a woman. That would be offensive. Yes, ma'am. All right. So you do what... if you catch them in the wrong mood, they can hurt your pocketbook even more. So, he's telling us, again, what's the rule of thumb regarding government? The duly appointed officers of the law want you to do good by protecting you from lawbreakers. Want to do you good by protecting you from lawbreakers. Now, what does Paul warn us if we become lawbreakers? Law enforcement officers are armed and dangerous to those who break the law. What does Paul call these officers? He calls them God's servants. Why? Because he's ordained. God is the one who's ordained the structure of law to protect us from anarchy. Note, 99% or more, in 99% or more cases, any government is preferred above anarchy. There are a few exceptions in the world, but normally any kind of government would be preferred over anarchy. Anarchy is when there's no rule and the guys with the biggest guns and the biggest number of people following them rule. And if they don't like it, they shoot you. So anarchy is not a good thing. So every government has to have some laws. Verse 5. Therefore it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. Now, what are the two reasons we should obey the law? We should obey it in order to avoid punishment. I hate paying for tickets.
Me too.
I hate paying for tickets. I don't know if I told you that, but I hate paying for tickets. Hate it with a passion. With that in mind, I should obey the law. Now, even then, there is, I'm going to guess, looking around this room, we don't have any 100% pure law keepers here. Not a single one of us. When it says 30, we think it means 35. If I'm on the freeway and the speed limit's 70, I don't know why, but when I read it, I see 75. And so that's where I put my cruise. My son sees another speed. And so that's where he puts his cruise. And so we pick a speed we don't think an officer will pull us over for. We go as high as we dare. We're breaking the law. But you know, my entire life, I went 5 miles an hour over the speed limit, and except 2 times when I got speeding tickets in a school zone, I didn't realize it was a school zone. Them are the only 2 speeding tickets I ever got. Other than that, anywhere else, I have never been ticketed for 5 miles an hour over, ever. So I feel good. They say 70. Well, they're saying 70 because they want me to go 75. But they know if they made the speed limit 75, I'd go 80. See, that's my logic. But anyway, and they're right. If the speed limit was 75, like it is up in South Dakota, I go 80 on the way up to Brookings. 5 mile an hour over, I feel safe. So none of us are 100% law breakers, or law keepers rather. Hopefully none of us are 100% law breakers either. But nonetheless, we need to understand there's 2 reasons to obey the law. Number 1 is to avoid penalties, and number 2 is because of conscience. Christians ought to want to be good citizens. All right. Now, here's something I'm going to throw a curveball at you here. When Paul was writing this letter, he was writing to Christians living in Rome. This is the book of Romans. Who was the emperor of Rome when Paul wrote this letter? Nero. One of the most wicked emperors ever was in charge. And Paul was telling people that governments are ordained of God. Now, you could get theologians in here and they would debate each other. What does that mean? Was it ordained of God that Nero be emperor? Or does he simply mean that the structure of the government of Rome was ordained of God? That God put people in authority there? It's above my pay grade. I'm not sure I can answer that. It could be that he ordained Nero to be. And you say, why would would God ordain such an evil person? Because he sees the big picture always. And he sees things that we can't see. If I'm right about Bible prophecy and what's coming down the turnpike toward us, when I read the book of Revelation, I don't see a lot of references that we could insert the U.S. into. I think the U.S. has to be a diminished power by that time, which means we got to get some corrupt government in here who thinks we're the villains of the earth, and people who will want us to diminish our military power, and something's got to happen, because right now we're the #1 power on the planet, and so there should be references in the book of Revelation, even though America wasn't there yet, about some country that we could say that prophet's seen America there. But there doesn't seem to be. So I hope, I like the way the country is going right now, and I wish it'd keep going that way. But if we're getting closer to, well, of course we're getting closer. Today you're a day closer than you were yesterday to the tribulation period. But if we're getting to where it's at hand, I see America having to be diminished. And I can't stand that thought. And why would God allow that? We got Christians praying for America all the time. Well, there's a couple possibilities. He allows it because, to wrap this up, there's got to be that 7-year period where the Antichrist comes. And so he lets things happen. Another reason, personally, my opinion, can't prove it with Scripture. If I can't satisfy myself that I'm proving something with Scripture, I want you to know that. I can't prove this with Scripture. It's my opinion, nothing more. I think one of the reasons America will be a diminished power when the tribulation period begins is because of the rapture. I personally believe that America will be the most impacted country on the planet when the rapture happens. We got 300, how many million? 50, about 350 million here. I personally believe over 100 million will disappear in the rapture. I have no way to prove that. Can you imagine a country that has 100 million people disappear shortly before the Antichrist shows up? It's going to be in chaos. Now every country will have some people disappear. But I believe America, I believe personally, because I believe God came to save the lost, so I don't have this bar way up here. I believe anyone who has genuinely put their faith in Christ is going to heaven, even if they remain a baby Christian their whole lives. Nobody should remain a baby Christian their whole Christian walk. But I believe if you're a baby Christian, you're going to heaven. And I believe personally somewhere between 33 and 50% of Americans would disappear at the rapture. There would be preachers that would shout me down to no way. No way on. They'll think only the evangelicals will go. Which would be a good number right there in itself. But I believe somewhere between a third and a half of America is going to disappear when they're trumped down. Can you imagine the decimation of this country? The only thing I can't explain, no matter how decimated the country is, they still got buttons to push with lots of nukes. So there's still a power. But for some reason they don't seem to enter into that 7-year period much. So other than like the rest of the world, they're going to face the Antichrist. All right, so I want you to know something about Nero. Paul wrote this to obey the law when one of the most evil people ever to walk this planet was in charge, Nero. You say, how evil was he? I want to read something to you from the the Believer's Bible Commentary. It is helpful to remember that Paul wrote this section on subjection to human government when the infamous Nero was emperor. Those were dark days for Christians. Now listen. Nero blamed them for a fire which destroyed half the city of Rome, and which he himself may have ordered. He caused, you want to know how evil he is, listen carefully. He caused some believers to be immersed in tar, and then a barrel of tar or whatever, and then ignited as living torches to provide illumination for his orgies. He set Christians on fire in tar. The tar would keep burning after the Christians were long dead. to light up the rooms he was having sexual orgies in. That's how evil this man was. Other Christians were sewn up in animal skins, then thrown to ferocious dogs to be torn to pieces. With that guy in charge, Paul wrote, obey the law. If Paul thought that Christians in Rome should obey the law, what do you think he would think about Christians in America? Nobody's putting us in tar and lighting us on fire. Nobody's wrapping us in animal skins and throwing us to wild dogs. If he expected Christians to be good citizens in Rome under that animal who was the emperor, I guarantee you he expects Christians in America to be good citizens, to obey the laws. All right. Acts 5, verses 25 to 29. Then someone came and said, look, the men you put in jail are standing in the temple courts teaching the people. At that, the captain with his officers went with his officers and brought the apostles. They did not force because they feared that the people would stone them. The apostles were favored. This isn't something that happened in Rome. This is from the book of Acts in the early days before Paul was even saved yet. But they arrested some people, and all of a sudden they show up in the streets preaching. So they didn't use force when they arrested them. They were afraid of the crowd. Verse 27, having brought the apostles, they made them appear before the Sanhedrin to be questioned by the high priest. We gave you strict orders not to teach in this name, he said, the high priest. Yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and are determined to make us guilty of this man's blood. Peter and the others responded, we must obey God rather than men. We must obey God rather than men. Why do I say that? Verse 1 of our lesson today, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities. What's the highest government of all? The government of heaven. And God's laws trump our laws. The head of every man is Christ. This could get me arrested nowadays. The head of every woman is the man. And the head of Christ is God. So Christ is the head of every man. Mankind makes laws. Christ is above those laws. I don't mean that Christ wouldn't be a good citizen. Of course he would be. What I mean, when there's a impact, a head-on collision between the laws of a country and the laws of God, who's the higher power? God is. So, to put all this in balance, it's not a big thing this morning. 5 years, it might be a huge thing. We're finding right now more and more laws are being written that are in total opposition against the laws of God. It could be more and more important. The ultimate bottom line is this: I'm to be a good citizen. However, I ought to obey God rather than men. So no matter what laws are written, I'll guarantee you with all these things they're doing right now, they want to make everything hate speech so they can attack the church. You can't preach against that anymore. You can't do that. All that will do, men and women of God will keep preaching what the Word says. It just means the first thing will happen, they'll lose their tax deduction. People won't be able to subtract money for their donations from their taxes. But eventually, when that doesn't shut us up, people do jail time for preaching the gospel, just like they did in the book of Acts. But the bottom line is we must obey God rather than men. So having said that, I want you to understand clearly in closing. Please understand this. In every other case where there's not a conflict between God's law and man's law, we are to obey the laws of this land. In every other case, except when those laws contradict the law of God. All right? The final verse down there, 1 Corinthians 11:3. Well, I've already referred to that. The head of every man is Christ. The head of the woman is man. The head of Christ is God. So we are to obey the highest power, and that highest power is God. But if you can't see a clear contradiction, you obey the civil powers as well.